Meanwhile, tensions between the United States and China, already high, are climbing even higher as the so-called Select Committee on the Capitol Hill began its first hearing on how to further contain China. First, here's my take. You know, one thing I learned from covering Washington politics for 8 years is that politicians in D.C. love acronyms, love them. From POTUS to FLOTUS, from CARE Act to FAIR Act. So given the recent Chinese bloom incident over the United States and given the collective rage against China displayed by both the Democrats and the Republicans, who agree on very little else these days, maybe it's time for a new acronym. Maybe the Congress should consider a Bonding Through Beijing Bashing Act, or BBB. Sorry, I know it's not a good idea to name a program that reminds people of another ill-fated one. I mean, Build Back Better was this beautiful promise on U.S. infrastructure and had been moving through the Senate for what, 3 years? Anyhow, the Bloom incident says a lot about the state of affairs in Washington. Getting tougher on China may not be the rational response to maximize American interests, but a necessary one politically. In fact, the United States was among the first countries to send blooms elsewhere. In January 1953, a total of 448 DWS-119L reconnaissance blooms were launched towards the former USSR, out of which about 380 blooms reached Soviet airspace. In July 1958, WS-461L blooms used the higher summer jet stream to fly into the former USSR, escorted by cover blooms or ones without cameras or other means of intelligence gathering. Now fast forward to 2022. According to China, the U.S. flew spy blooms into Chinese airspace more than 10 times that year. We're not even talking about NSA surveillance programs. Remember PRISM? That collects, store the internet communications based on demands made to internet companies such as Google? Or Stateroom, that is a highly secretive program intercepting international radio telecommunications and internet traffic in 100 U.S. embassies and consulates worldwide. Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank and former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, said that Washington's reaction is a lost opportunity to improve ties. He said, afraid of looking soft on China, the Biden administration is failing to turn China's blunder into a diplomatic opportunity. Instead of postponing Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to China in protest, President Biden should have directed Blinken to present Chinese President Xi Jinping with recommendations to increase transparency and lessen dangers. That is a concern shared by others in that Biden's China policy is compromised over and over again by the need to please the Republicans, and that may be the case in the foreseeable future. Let's face it, Biden needs some political space to implement his China policy, which he originally intended, in which he says he does not want conflict or a new Cold War. And those China hawks could perhaps see China less through the xenophobic, chauvinistic, and belligerent lenses, and China's policies and intentions, of course, could be better communicated and understood too. Now, for more discussions, joining me from Henderson, Nevada, the United States, is William Li, Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. And in Beijing, China, we have Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. There is this Select Committee on, China Containment Act, basically. Of course, it has a fancier name, regarding China, managing China-U.S. strategic competition. First of all, I want to play you some thoughts from this committee.
It's not a polite tennis match. This is an existential struggle over what life will look like in the 21st century. And the most fundamental freedoms are at stake.
We must deter aggression by the CCP. We do not want a war with the PRC. Not a Cold War, not a hot war. We don't want a clash of civilizations. But we seek a durable peace. And that is why we have to deter aggression.
The economic policies of the Chinese Communist Party represent a clear and present danger to the American worker, our innovation base, and our national security.
So Andy Mock, let me go to you first. This Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. What do you make of that?
Well, Wang Guan, first of all, thanks for having me. This struck me as both delusional and alarming and reminded me of the Glenn Close character in the movie Fatal Attraction, where she ends up not only hurting people around her, but herself. Because the delusion is, if you look at especially Matt Pottinger's opening statement, who, by the way, Matt is, I think, kind of the scheming puppet master pulling the strings behind a lot of this, is that there are these myths that the China is not a communist country. It does not want to change the world. And through these secret speeches that they've discovered that China is all of these things. And you know, this is common knowledge for anyone that covers China, that China believes that its system works for itself, may have valuable lessons for others in the world. And there's no secret here. And, you know, I think this delusion is really hurting the U.S. And, of course, hurting countries around the world as well. And, you know, it's really sad that this is happening.
William Lee in Nevada, what do you make of this committee? What does it do? Any bills that is passed? What is really the purpose of setting up yet another China-related committee on the Capitol Hill?
Well, Wang Guang, again, thank you for having me here. And I must say, Andy probably woke up on the wrong side of bed. I hear a lot of virulence and venom coming out of him in his interpretation of what was said. And from what I hear, the committee was set up because I think the U.S. government is recognizing that China has become a real stiff competitor to U.S. industry. And there's a lot of concern that there may be job losses and loss of market share to Chinese competitors. And I think the concern of the committee is that they're trying to protect U.S. workers, and they're trying to find out where is it that China has been so successful, and why is it that U.S. Companies may or may not be able to compete as effectively. So I think a lot of the rhetoric is in preparation for the election campaign, because I think the Republicans are going to come out very strong, that they're there to protect the American worker. And I think the China is really being used as a vehicle to try to focus on what is needed to restructure the American economy and help American workers.
Well, Andy, do you want to respond?
Well, I don't disagree that certainly there is an element of these hearings to focus on increasing American competitiveness. And I certainly hope that that does happen. That's good for the United States. That's good for the world. But we have to look at the written record. So Matt Pottinger is quoted as saying the source of his antagonism towards China is China's efforts to subvert American power and influence, first in China, next in the region, and then the world. And I think what this implies, of course, is that he and perhaps others like him believe that the U.S. should rightfully exert power and influence in China. And this, again, I think goes back to my point that this is delusional and self-defeating.
Well, I think what Matt Pottinger didn't say is probably his anger towards China derived from his days as a Wall Street Journal reporter decades ago, and his many episodes with relevant people here in China. He's not going to say that, right? William Lee, what do you make of the fact that this committee is, saying that it wants to talk to the Wall Street firms to better understand the complexities of so-called de-risking or selective economic decoupling? Does this suggest that the trade war between China and the United States, or trade conflicts, whatever you call it, might escalate in the future?
Well, I think it reflects the fact that we don't have a viable framework for trade between the two largest countries in the world. And the failure of the trade negotiations during the Trump administration and the apparent failure of the Biden administration to get much further progress shows that we need to put something in place. And I think the concerns that are being expressed about national security and the desire to talk to Wall Street firms is to find out why is it that investments are not settling in on the United States to try to build up the semiconductor industry here, to build up more of the supply chain that COVID has taught us we cannot stretch out too far and to diversify the U.S. economy so that we can produce more of the vital goods and services here in the United States. And I think the Wall Street firms' reply has been that a lot of the U.S. domestic regulations have made it very unfriendly to produce stuff here, and China has been a very friendly audience in welcoming foreign capital. And President Xi Jinping's latest speech has said, we do welcome foreign capital, and I think that is the tension that is facing U.S. Legislatures who have put in place a lot of regulations to incentivize firms to leave the United States, and at the same time, they want them to come back to produce the vital goods and services. So I think the tension is being heard here, and I don't think there's any kind of ulterior motive to try to put down China. In fact, it's a recognition that China has become a formidable competitor and is a fertile ground for a lot of foreign investments. So I think going forward, the problem that the U.S. legislatures have got to face, especially in this election year, is to elect officials who will recognize how global competition can be enhanced and to better both parties for customers and producers around the world.
Well, talking about chips, let me stay with you, William. The Department of Commerce has just announced that the U.S. chip makers operating in China cannot access a federal funding worth $39 billion. They have to halt their operations in China for at least a decade if they want to access this massive amount of fund. What do you make of that?
That's a great point. In fact, that's a great example. I should have used that as my example for why it is that the legislatures have to reassess themselves. They've learned in their discussions from the Wall Street firms and the private equity firms that investment is fungible. A dollar is a dollar, and the CHIPS Act was to provide a pool of money to incentivize large companies to produce chips here in the United States, to employ American workers, and to employ American engineers. And what they're trying to prevent, and the reason why they put these restrictive incentives in place, is to prevent firms from cutting back on investments and using the federal dollars and using the investment dollars that they would have put in place someplace else, like to invest in other plants in other parts of the world. So I think the fear of crowding out investments that would have taken place is something that these restrictions are designed to say, if you're going to make investments in the United States, you have to keep them in the United States, and they can't be substitutes for the kind of investments that you would have made here. And doing that is a very tricky thing, and the legislation that is put in place and its implementation through the administrators and the regulatory agencies is going to have to be very careful in designing the incentives so that we increase the pie that is being produced here and not just slice off more of it to be paid for by the U.S. government and less of it to be paid for by the shareholders.
Yeah. In China, we have a similar saying, make the pie bigger instead of dividing it only. Andy, more on the technology front, on Monday, the White House gave a 30-day deadline to government agencies to remove the popular app, TikTok, from federal devices and systems. In response, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said, and I quote, "How unsure of itself can the United States, the world's top superpower, be to fear a young person's favorite app to such a degree?" I mean, is the U.S. overreacting to TikTok fear?
I think it certainly is. And again, I think we come back to this idea of being delusional. And just very briefly, I want to add about the private equity part. We have to recognize that American private equity firms, hedge funds, VC firms invest in China not because they like China, but because the returns are attractive, and not just the gross returns, the risk-adjusted returns. And this benefits the limited partners or the pension funds, the insurance funds that give them the money. And this ultimately benefits the American people that rely on these investment returns for their retirements, for other important needs. So I think, again, this is very, very counterproductive. And the move with TikTok is the same. I think it's symbolic. Most of the users of TikTok are young, teenagers, probably not government workers. But still, it does signal a certain, I think, paranoia and a certain lack of confidence, Wang Guan. So I would agree with you there.
Yeah, I want to move gears and talk about Taiwan. Representative Mike Gallanfer, who is chairing the committee of managing the U.S.-China strategic competition, made a clandestine trip to Taiwan in February. He said that people in Taiwan told him they would welcome a so-called fact-finding trip by the committee on the possibility of the quote-unquote military invasion by Beijing. Is the committee really going to play the Taiwan card? William?
Well, I think the committee is concerned about the growing voices that are coming out of the foreign ministry that resound and endorse wolf warrior tactics and wolf warrior diplomacy. And I think there was concern, a growing concern in the United States that while nationalism is something that the U.S. would certainly favor and the Chinese government has a lot to be proud of in its achievements of how quickly the economy has grown, this tone has shifted toward more belligerence and much more of a concern for the countries in the South China Seas about the growing militarism that's being present in the various islands in the South China Seas, as well as the overflights in Taiwan. And I think one of the things that the Republican committee is trying to demonstrate is that we still adhere to the long-standing policy that China and the U.S. has agreed to the last 40 years of recognizing that there is one China, there's a one China policy, that Taiwan itself is something that the U.S. will try to preserve the trade relations and other relationships with. So I think one of the things that we have to be aware of, though, is that the United States right now is concerned about the tone of voice that comes out of the foreign ministry and the increased sense of belligerence. And that has really caused not just the United States, but South Korea, Japan, Australia, India, to be concerned about what the intentions are of foreign policy and military policy in China.
I think in a nutshell, China's intentions are not always understood, and it needs to be better understood. So that's all the time we have, I'm afraid. Andy and William, thank you both so very much. That will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you for tuning in. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.